Good. Well, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this Whitehall and Industry Group webinar. Today we're talking about the future of natural capital and how to account for it. Natural capital is the world's stocks of natural assets from which we derive our ecosystem services, which makes, of course, human life possible. As we progress towards a greener economy, one hopes there has been a growing interest in how industry and government must account for natural resources and the beneficial functions they perform. This raises a number of questions: how the valuation of natural contributions and resources could work in practice, how natural capital accounting, borrowing presumably from the UN system of environmental economic accounting, could enshrine environmental responsible practices, the ways that investment in natural capital projects can also ensure a return on investment. The Environment Bill is at the committee stage in the House of Commons with a committee report on 25th of June, but some, including the Natural Capital Committee, have some reservations on approach being taken despite the great leaps that we have taken in recent years. We're delighted to hear from Professor Dieter Helm, Chairman of the Natural Capital Committee, who's going to take us through the government's ambitions in this space and how natural capital could be used to empower green growth. Before I introduce him more fully, though, I'll just go through the traditional housekeeping. If you're finding it difficult to either see or hear me, then there are some options. You might log out and log in again, and it's worth noting that Chrome is the best platform for this particular format. If you are continuing to have any sort of problems, if you type a message in the bottom right where it says type your message, then one of the team will endeavour to help you. Later, as we invite questions, it's the same dialogue box on the bottom right hand side, but if we can ask you just to click the little question mark icon and then type your question, and it would be most useful if you could put the organisation you work for in the first line of your question, which provides a bit of context. Top right of your screen is something called the events board, and there you can see a full list of the delegates listening this afternoon. I think without further ado, I will introduce our speaker. Before I do, actually, it's worth noting we are going to carry out a short poll, one question after Professor Helm's comments. Very easy, just click on the screen and you'll see the question when it comes up. Professor Dieter Helm CBE, Professor of Economic Policy and Chairman Natural Capital Committee. Professor of Economic Policy at University of Oxford and Official Fellow in Economics at New College. As I say, he's chair of the Natural Capital Committee and completed the Helm Review on the cost of energy for the British government in 2017 and has been widely published on the subject of natural capital, including both a recent book, Green and Prosperous Land, I think published last year, and his latest book, either imminently published or has just been published, called Net Zero. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Professor Helm.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me along. I should say my comments in a personal capacity, though I will be covering quite a lot of what the Natural Capital Committee has been up to. So let me take you back to 2011, almost a decade ago. The then government had not exactly inherited a great position on the environment, and they did stretch themselves to produce a white paper called The Natural Choice. And this white paper was very well bedecked with pictures. Indeed, the ratio of pictures to text was very much on the picture side, and my test of a white paper is always what that ratio turns out to be. But it did have a couple of things in it which have turned out to be really extremely significant. The first thing the Natural Choice white paper said was that it was going to put the environment into the heart of economic policy and no longer think of the environment as something separate, and in particular some kind of luxury good which one day we might be able to afford. And the second thing it said was that it was going to be the first government to leave the natural environment in a better state for the next generation than it inherited it. Now, both of those things are very easy for governments to say. And if you read the rest of the white paper in 2011, there isn't much by way of a guide to how any of this is going to be achieved. So in true Yes Minister Sir Humphrey style, the government proposed that it was going to set up a committee to think about it. And when the then Prime Minister David Cameron asked me whether I would chair this committee, my immediate reaction was, you must be joking. But actually, the Natural Capital Committee was tasked with virtually a blank piece of paper and told to go away, think about the problems and advise how this overarching objective might be achieved, and within the context of making sure that the environment was mainstreamed into economic policy. And to that end, the Natural Capital Committee reported to the Economics Subcommittee of the Cabinet, not to DEFRA. And we continue to report to one of the Cabinet committees as our primary focus, and that has made the Treasury at least as important as DEFRA in the work we've done. So we had a pretty clear start with a blank piece of paper, and lucky to have some extremely talented people to join the committee. Now, we spent the first period up to 2015 working out how to do natural capital, how to do corporate accounting, how to measure natural capital, how to do the metrics, how to work out which natural capital assets were most important, and how to help the government integrate that into the Green Book and Treasury numbers too. And there was a third annual report, I'm sorry to be a bit sort of bureaucratic about it, where we set that methodology out extremely clearly, and it remains a defining document in how to do natural capital. We developed a how to do it workbook as well, and we had groups of landowners, we had corporates, etc., working around that. But it's one thing to work out the methodology, it's quite another thing to work out how practically, and although we're an independent committee, politically it would be doable. And so we came up with the idea that if you really wanted to do this, achieving a better state for the natural environment for the next generation, you needed a generational plan. And we proposed the 25-year plan. And after a couple more secretaries of state, I think I've had 7 or 8 since we started, Michael Gove became Secretary of State, took the 25-year plan on board, although all major political parties signed up to the idea of a 25-year plan in 2015, and we advised on what should go into that 25-year plan, and now we have it. That 25-year plan isn't perfect by any means, but it has 10 goals, and the question is, how far are those goals going to go into statutory form and be actually implemented? And it's inevitably in a political context, it's a mixed picture, but 4 of the 10 goals are to be provided with statutory targets by ministers. The 5th is, of course, carbon, and that already has a statutory requirement. And these go through into the Environment Bill, currently now pretty much fast tracking through Parliament, and that in turn will be all carried through and overseen by the Office for Environmental Protection, which is due to start next year. So the frame's there, the methodology's there, and the Natural Capital Committee has virtually fulfilled its remit now. It hands over to the Office of Environmental Protection at the end of the year on current plans. And now it's down to the practicalities of getting this stuff done. Now, I mentioned accounting. It was very important to us early on. If you can't measure things, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily not important because you can't measure them, but it's quite hard to work out how you're going to take them into account. The fortunate thing about natural capital is that it's an asset-based concept. There are lots of people who seem to think that it's, like supply chain stuff, or it's about ecosystem services, or even habitats. And this is to miss the central point. What we're in the business of doing is doing capital maintenance for natural capital assets, such that the next generation will get those assets against which they can choose how to live their lives. It's not about making future people happy. It's not utilitarian in that sense, although utility, of course, matters. It's not about measuring eco services per se, although those are an important way of getting at the underlying asset. It's the asset itself. And accounting, and particularly current cost accounting, lends itself to that. It lends itself to balance sheets, to assets and liabilities, and it lends itself to, as I say, capital maintenance, but not depreciation. We've set all that out. The ONS is working away at this to produce national natural capital accounts, and many corporations are starting to grapple with it. Now, in that area, I should say there is a right way of doing this and a wrong way of doing this. And the real risk in natural capital has always seemed to me that it'll go the way of sustainability. Who couldn't be in favor of sustainability? But large number of corporations, organizations, lobbyists, vested interests claim things are sustainable with measures to suit their interests, which aren't actually meeting the overall requirement. And when I look round at the various protocols and different accounting systems being promoted by consultancies, NGOs, etc., I'm somewhat horrified at some of these, and very, very keen and enthusiastic to make sure that we really do these things properly, so we avoid greenwashing, which is all too apparent in any area of the environment. Maintaining and enhancing natural capital is a difficult thing to do. It's tough. In many cases, it's got costs. In many cases, it's got economic benefits, but it has to be done right. And that is an important part, I hope, of the legacy the Natural Capital Committee will leave going forward. And when we look at the legislation happening now, I'm quite often asked whether I'm kind of disappointed or, is the Environment Bill up to scratch, etc. Well, if you asked us when we started out after the Natural Choice White Paper, which was largely contentless in terms of, excuse me, interventions to improve things, and where we are now. The Agricultural Bill has public goods for public money on the face of the bill. The Environment Bill has the 25-year plan and essentially carries through the powers to set the statutory targets, and we have net zero on the statute book. I suspect in 2050, when people look back, 219, 220 will be seen to be pretty decisive in terms of environmental legislation. Of course, we'll know in 250 whether ministers lived up to their promises and actually delivered, or simply carried on with the kinds of environmental damage we've had to date. So hopefully we're in a good place. I'm very proud of what the Natural Capital Committee has done. We do have clear methodologies, we have clear metrics, we have clear accounting approaches, we have clear sorting out of what are the important natural capital assets, and we have a legislative framework. In one sense, what's not to like about that? But in another sense, so that's the start. Now the job is to get on with it. Thank you very much.